So, I don't know if I've told you all this, but I like Thomas the Tank Engine. However, Thomas isn't the only show out there about personified train characters. In fact, there is a whole other show about talking trains, and for a while was a very serious competitor to Thomas. Some love it, some hate it, but you all know it. It's a show called Now I'll be honest, Chuggington is a bit of a guilty pleasure show of mine, in that it's a show that I've enjoyed watching every once in a while, even though I don't necessarily like to admit it. The show focuses on Wilson, Coco, and Brewster, three trainee characters. Trainee, get it? Who live in a town called Chuggington. It focuses on their trials and tribulations before eventually getting promoted and becoming experts in their own respective fields. It's a surprisingly character-driven show. It can also be a little batshit insane. Ah yes, there is really no other show quite like Chuggington, other than the obvious elephant in the room. Believe it or not, I'm actually quite nostalgic for Chuggington. I remember watching it years ago on BBC and enjoying it quite a bit, but I was younger back then, and some time has passed, so I wanted to go back and see if Chuggington still holds up after all these years. And especially after the roller coaster that has been the Thomas franchise these last few years, and after seeing some of the things that show has done, perhaps we were all a little too hard on Chuggington. Is there truly nothing to appreciate about this show? Is the show sometimes slept on by Thomas fans? Well, let's find out. To put it bluntly, Chuggington is a bit of a punching bag in the Thomas fandom. Many Thomas fans will look their noses down at Chuggington as the inferior talking train show. Now, before all you sophisticated Thomas fans start spitting out your wine, just hear me out here. I'm going to give Chuggington a fair and balanced review. Yes, I will be comparing it to Thomas a lot, but I'm still going to try and give it an honest chance. Plus, Thomas's track record isn't exactly squeaky clean itself, so I think it's only fair that we give Chuggington the benefit of the doubt. So I'm going to give it a fair and honest review. Now, I teased this video well over 6 months ago on another Chuggington retrospective video, which I think you should all totally check out, and now, 6 months later, it finally seems like a good time to talk about that. And we're going to finally answer the question, is Chuggington a ripoff of Thomas? So, with all that said, come ride the rails with me as we go back in time to one of the most Traintastic shows ever. This is the Chuggington Retrospective. Chuggington, the show, was essentially created as a counterculture to Thomas and Friends. The show basically wanted to be everything that Thomas the Tank Engine wasn't. That's right, the idea for Chuggington was created by a dick. Dick whatever. Dick was a former CEO of Learning Curve, and he was not the biggest fan of Thomas the Tank Engine or its handling of the brand. This was back in like 2005, so around the same time that Series 9 of Thomas was coming out. Dick has gone on record in the past describing Thomas as too mean and terribly gender biased, and that the values of the show promoted were too old-fashioned for modern audiences. That's right, the guy who created Chuggington hated Thomas. I think that kind of tells you everything you need to know about this show. So the pitch for Chuggington was essentially a more modern and up-to-date version of Thomas the Tank Engine. Dick teamed up with Rob Laws, a former CEO of Hit Entertainment of all places, and together they formed Lundorum and started developing Dick's idea for a new, more up-to-date train property. While Dick was the guy with the idea for the show, the real creator credit actually goes to industry veteran Sarah Ball. Sarah Ball was the creator, director, and writer for most of Chuggington. You may also know her as the woman who wrote literally every single Bob the Builder special, and she was also a producer on that show. Now, I've actually been an admirer of Sarah's work for quite a long time, and I think her work on Chuggington really shines through. Like, if Chuggington has a heart, I definitely think it comes from Sarah Ball. Soon, concept art was drawn up of the Chuggers, and the show entered into production. Now, Chuggington took a very loose approach to bases they chose, like how Olwyn is based on a mallard, but just without the tender, or how Zeffy is based on a scissor crane, which is very bizarre. The concepts were much more gimmicky, like an ice cream chugger in the form of Frostini, or a Superman chugger in the form of Action Chugger, a very bizarre concept that only Chuggington could pull off, or a Safari chugger in the form of Matambo. All these concepts are so kiddie, and they're definitely concepts that Thomas wouldn't have done. Well, at least not back in 2009 anyway. Ugh, god, how times change. I highly recommend going through the concept art for Chuggington, as it's very fascinating stuff, like the different designs that they were going for with the logo, like having them be all 3D parts of trains, or a city skyline, or my favourite has to be the incorporation of the London Underground logo into it. That one was really cool. By July of 2007, CGI assets were made for the series, and an unreleased pilot episode was made. That's right, even Chuggington has a lost pilot too. We only have a few promo pics of the pilot, but the show looks more or less the same to the final product, minus a few cosmetic changes. For the casting, unlike Thomas, they actually got kid actors for the voices of the Chuggers.
I will Santini, I bring your ice creamy. It tastes so yummy to go in your tummy.
I'm usually not a big fan of casting kids as the voices of the characters, because it usually sounds really bad. All in just go. But I must say, the casting of the kid characters is really well done. In fact, the producers particularly liked the way that Imogen Bailey pronounced Traintastic for Coco.
I got the voice of Coco by coming to an audition and reading out a few lines from a script. They loved the way I say Traintastic. Traintastic!
Charlie George did the voice of Brewster.
Hi, I'm Charlie George, I'm 11 and I play Brewster in Chuggington. Honking horns!
And Wilson was voiced by Morgan Overton.
I'm Morgan Overton and I play Wilson in Chuggington.
Huh, this Morgan Overton sounds like an interesting individual. Oh no! Oh no! Eventually the show was picked up by BBC and ordered 26 episodes. However, Series 1 actually had 52 episodes. This is a common thing in TV production where instead of commissioning a Series 2, they'll just add extra episodes onto a series. Hence why Chuggington Series 1 has 52 episodes while Series 2 only has 26. The first batch aired in around 2008 while the second batch aired in 2009, which was pretty much around the same time that Thomas also switched to CGI. So most of the comparisons between the two will be of that era. With Chuggington animation being provided by Shanghai Motion Magic Digital, that's pretty much all the background of Chuggington. So, now that we've covered that, let's get into the show. Now, believe it or not, there is actually a classic era to Chuggington, at least in my opinion anyway. First 3 seasons are what I'd classify as the classic era of Chuggington. This is the show that most people think of when they think of the show Chuggington. As I said before, the show mainly focuses on Wilson, Brewster and Coco. Unlike Thomas, which only had one protagonist, Chuggington is interesting in that it's much more evenly split amongst the 3 trainees. Yes, most episodes will pick one of them as a protagonist, but there's no overall series protagonist, you know? It's much more about these 3 chuggers and their relationships and their dynamics. I guess Wilson is the closest to a main character, but the writers still go out of their way to make sure that all 3 of them are equally represented. Wilson, the red diesel, is based on an EMD-F unit, aka literally the first diesel that comes to mind when you think of an American locomotive. And to be fair, they're actually quite good lookers. I think the choice of making all the main characters diesel or electric locos was a conscious one, almost as a way of disassociation with Thomas, and it also gives the show a much more modern appeal. Now, Wilson is the most interesting of the 3 in my opinion, in that he is the youngest of them, which means he has the biggest arc. He has a very hyperactive personality and he will often act without thinking. He is very impatient when it comes to learning something, he's often the loudest and talks very quick, and he's often the instigator of a lot of plots.
Ooh. Oh, bumpers!
Many fans have pointed out that Wilson shares a lot of traits with ADHD syndrome. That's attention deficit or hyperactive disorder. Now, while I don't think this was intentional from the writers to give Wilson ADHD, the fact that Wilson, one of the main protagonists of Chuggington, has signs of ADHD, while Thomas the Tank Engine is very much associated with autism, I think really says a lot about the 2 shows. While Thomas's slower pace and easier to read faces catered much more to an autistic demographic, I think it's also fair to say that Chuggington catered towards an ADHD demographic. While we all talk about the slower pace and the easier going tone of Thomas and how it helped autistic people, I think it's also fair to say that Chuggington helped out the other kid in the class who had ADHD. So in that regard, I kind of like the show. As much as I'm glad that autistic children have a show like Thomas, part of me is also glad that children with ADHD also have a show like Chuggington, and it's one of the reasons why I think Wilson makes so much sense as a main character. Out of all the characters, Wilson is also the youngest, and so he is the one who tends to have the most development over the course of the series, going from the most irresponsible of the chuggers to a rescue chugger. He is definitely the character who learns the most throughout the series. Now, Coco is the green one. Out of the 3 of them, she is the only electric engine. She doesn't have an exact basis outside a general idea for a fast engine, hence her catchphrase, "Can't catch Coco." Being much quicker than Wilson, and especially Brewster, this can cause Coco to become quite cocky. She tends to have an inflated ego about being the quickest and the best, often putting down Brewster or Wilson for being, as she puts it, slow coaches. But despite Coco's attitude towards them, she has been humbled on quite a few occasions.
I hope no one sees me like this.
There's a power cut, Coco.
And when all is said and done, she is still a very good friend to others. She is also the only girl out of the three of them, and as Dick said, he wants to give a more gender balance, hence why Coco is female. I do like this decision as it helps shake up the dynamic of the main cast a little better, and it helps her feel a little more unique from Wilson or Brewster. And then there's Brewster. I didn't realize this until making this video, but Brewster does actually have a basis in real life, a BR Class 55, or a Deltic, which is pretty cursed when you think about it. Like, why does he not have a cab on the back? Now, out of the three, Brewster is probably the least interesting, but he still plays a pretty important role in the show. Brewster is the most mature of the three. He's kind of like the opposite to Wilson, in that he's much more methodical and logically minded. He's much less likely to jump into situations, whereas Wilson and Coco are all about speed, and he's much more about doing things slowly.
Brain working, check. Arms grabbing.
Slowest chugger in the world, check.
While the slowest of the three, he also is the most methodical and thoughtful of the few. Now, putting these three together, and you get a very interesting dynamic. All of their personalities and strengths and weaknesses all really help complement each other very well. Remove one of them and the group kind of feels incomplete, you know? They really do work together as contrasting characters.
With Coco's speed, Brewster's brains, and my good looks, we're unstoppable!
Now, the premise for Chuggington, at least in the early years, is that we follow these three trainees, get it, as they learn about how to become more mature characters like the older Chuggers. In a lot of ways, Chuggington is kind of like an allegory for school, where you have these young characters training and progressing as they go throughout the series, learning from the older Chuggers, and eventually graduating into their own respective fields. Your average episode for Chuggington will usually have an A plot and a B plot. The A plot being about the trainees learning something new, while the B plot is about one of the older characters getting into trouble. And then the two plots come together in the end, where the trainee used what he or she learned earlier in the plot to save the day. Now, I must say, it actually is a really good formula for a TV show. Having two plots means the episode never feels dull, and it's always satisfying to see the two plots come together. Compare that to Thomas, where the formula for 8 seasons was characters do something wrong 3 times, really gets repetitive really fast. I think the pacing was something that Chuggington did really well. Ironically enough, people will say that the pacing of Chuggington was too fast, but I honestly think the pacing of Chuggington was just perfect. One of the best things about Chuggington in the classic era was the characters. The supporting cast for Chuggington are surprisingly in-depth. Ironically enough, they're actually quite three-dimensional characters. The thing about Thomas is that a lot of the characters tend to have very pigeonholed personalities. Like, Thomas is the cheeky one, Gordon's the grumpy one, Emily's the bossy one, but clever, James is vain. They all have very surface-level personality traits, at least in the hit era. Whereas Chuggington takes a much more nuanced approach to the characters, where you can't quite pigeonhole them into one particular trait. Like, yeah, you can say that Puffer Pete is old, or Callie is helpful or something, but that nearly does a disservice to the characters, as I think there's a lot more going on with them below the surface. They're almost like characters that you have to experience just in order to truly understand who they are. Dunbar, for example, is a green diesel chugger, and he acts like the teacher to the trainees. He's often the one showing them how to use certain cars. He's a very good role model to the kids watching at home to show how a good teacher should act. And one thing I love about the UK dub is that they gave him a very distinctive Scottish accent.
You follow the signs and instructions you're given, and they will lead you to a special surprise.
I remember back when Chuggington was airing on CBeebies, and I'd always love whenever Dunbar spoke. There's just something about his Scottish accent that really gives off a certain energy of lived experience, which I really like. Also, fun fact, Dunbar is actually a real place in Scotland, so I'm guessing that's probably where they got his name from, and probably why he has a Scottish accent. He also has Salty's horn sound effect.
Now, jump to action!
Which is pretty cursed. Speaking of sound effects, one of the things I quite like about Chuggington is the music. Now, it goes without saying that it doesn't hold a candle to Thomas, but I do actually find the music clever. You'll notice that the music in Chuggington actually uses train noises, like train bells or railway crossings, or the sound that a train would make when it's running along a track. Even some of the characters have their own themes. Now, I don't know about you, but I am quite the Callie fan. Callie is one of the older chuggers in Chuggington, and also acts as a mentor. She's a breakdown and rescue chugger, and she even has her own little shed. She's a very mature and sensible character, and like I said, it's very difficult to pin down what she is because the characters in Chuggington are quite nuanced. But I think that Callie is an example of an actual strong female character. Again, like Dick said, he wanted to give a better gender balance to the show, compared to Thomas, and I definitely think Callie is a good example of that. Not just her, but Zeffy and Olwen and Coco and V, all of them feel very unique as characters. Some are old, some are young, some are mother-like, rather than all being just generic girls. Thomas. Another example of a good girl character is V. V. I have a lot of questions about V. Like, what the hell is she exactly? Okay, so like, she's a personified public addressing system, which I guess is an interesting concept, you know? And she also acts as like the de facto fat controller of that universe, but like, what is she? Is she an artificial intelligence? Or is there like a woman behind the speaker making the announcements who just happens to be called V? The show never really explains. Could you imagine how funny it would have been if in the series finale or something they revealed that V is actually being controlled by a woman just called V in some office or something, and all the trainees are like, wait, V, you're real? And V is like, of course I'm real. Why wouldn't I be? That would have been so funny. And then there's also Olwen, who will definitely bring back flashbacks of a certain other character. It's actually kind of funny seeing the same basis in Chuggington as Thomas, because you almost get a different take on how the character would look in each show. And yes, Lexi is also somehow canon in Chuggington. Go figure. Now, speaking of Olwen, something I really like about Chuggington was how it played with age of the characters. For example, all the older steam engines like Puffer Pete, Olwen, and Speedy are all really old characters. Olwen is like this old granny, while Puffer Pete is like this granddad to all the chuggers. A steam engine as an old granddad character is such a fun concept to me. I really wish that Thomas played with him more. They have such a sweet dynamic, like how Olwen calls him Peter instead of Pete.
Peter, are you alright, dear?
Just a spot of wheezes, that's all.
Percy and Thomas acting young, despite being steam engines, has always kind of bothered me, so I really like that Chuggington leaned more into this angle of making all the steam engines be the older characters. Although part of me wonders if Chuggington was just making fun of Thomas, like, hey, we're the modern show. I wonder if that was like a little dig, the fact that they made all the older characters be like steam engines. Was that like a dig at Thomas? Who knows? All of the concepts for the characters feel so inspired and realized to me. Like Hodge, for example, and how his name comes from being a hodgepodge engine. Although he does bear a striking resemblance to rail motors, Hodge is one of the most down-to-earth characters in the show. I think my favorite episode out of the whole show might be Hodge and the Magnet, where there's a piece of broken track and Hodge and Wilson decide to go and repair it without Eddie while he's late. This episode is genuinely so funny. The whole situation just gets progressively worse and worse. First, Eddie is late.
Hodge left with the stuff to fix it.
Oh, so that's what Morgan was talking about. Oh, silly me. Uh-oh.
Then Wilson tries to help Hodge, before making the situation even worse by removing 3 tracks instead of 1.
Oh, bumpers. Now there are 3 pieces out.
What?
All the whilst V is acting more panicked than she's ever been. I also just love how depressed Hodge is throughout the whole episode. It's so funny.
I wish Eddie was here. Oh, this is the bit I don't like. Oh, I should never have let you talk me into this. Look, it's no use. I can't do it. Okay.
Wilson and Hodge honestly make such a good pairing together, because they're kind of like total opposites. Hodge is this down-to-earth and calm character, while Wilson is just incredibly hyperactive.
I don't know why Eddie never lets me do things on my own.
Which leads to many fun and interesting plots with them. But by far my favourite dynamic with Hodge has to be the one with Eddie. These two are so adorable together.
Come here.
Oh, Eddie. Ugh, get it off.
No way.
Eddie.
Like when Eddie keeps on being late to work and he ends up sleeping inside the workshop with Hodge, or how Hodge goes out of his way to look for a house for him. It's honestly such a sweet relationship they have. Also, side note, this episode has Merlin's whistle sound effect in it. I guess Merlin really is a Chuggington character. As much as people like to talk about Thomas being realistic with human characters, I think it's fair to say that Chuggington also did a pretty remarkable job with having humans play important roles in the show. Like Eddie, Morgan, and Laurie all feel like 3-dimensional characters. Dare I say Chuggington did a better job of interacting realistic humans into the show? At least compared to Nitrogen era Thomas anyway, I think so. This is something I only just realized on my rewatch, but this show has so many genuinely funny moments. Like the Magnet episode, or the Wilson jump scare, or this scene that legit had me in stitches on my rewatch.
This seems quiet.
Yeah, with a bit of work, this could be nice.
A lot of the comedy in this show really comes from the characters. Again, it feels very Bob the Builder-esque in that style of comedy. Tonally, I think it feels completely different to Thomas. While Thomas relied more on the narrator telling the story, Chuggington is much more like Bob the Builder, in that it's the characters themselves who drive the plots forward. I feel like Chuggington was much more interested in entertaining you than Thomas was. Like the way the characters are much more expressive with the way that they bounce, and having plots that younger children could very easily relate to. As Sarah Ball says, some of her biggest inspiration actually come directly from children themselves. Even with the older characters, they're like people that young children would interact with. Like Emery, for example, who kind of reminds me of a jerky older brother.
Yes! I've broken down, but there's nothing wrong with my ears.
He's honestly got a similar character to Bill and Ben. Not as a twin, obviously, but rather, he's a bit of a jokester or prankster to the other engines. He almost feels like a teenager to me. Like how he's not quite as mature as some of the other chuggers, but he is still older than characters like Wilson. But the way he treats them, he's honestly kind of a dick.
Now that's a story.
It really isn't funny, you know?
But I think that's what I kind of like about him. He does feel like a dick older brother character, but then again, that's a character that younger children might interact with. And then there's Harrison and Chatsworth, who are like a parallel to the younger trainees, where the two of them were once trainees themselves in Chuggington, but now they're kind of middle-aged, and they kind of act as mentors to the others. Again, many people have pointed out the similarities between Harrison and Gordon, and yeah, I can kind of see that. The two big blue engines that act older than the other chuggers, and are very sophisticated with the way they speak, yeah, I can see it.
Mirror, mirror in your car, who's the best looking chugger by far?
But Harrison, while extremely proud of himself, is also incredibly charming as a character, and I think most of that charm goes to his voice actor, Colin McFarlane, who you may also know as the voice of Beresford or Bulgy and Thomas. Man, what is it with the Journey Beyond Sorter connections in this video? First Merlin, now Lexi, now Beresford. What's next? The bouncer? Oh wait. But yeah, Colin honestly gives Harrison so much heart. Honestly, part of me wishes Colin had voiced Gordon in Journey Beyond Soder onwards. As no offense to Keith Wickham, but I think by that point we were all getting kinda sick of Gordon's voice. I mean hell, they recast James with Rob Rackstraw in that movie. I think Colin would have been a welcome addition too. Because the voice for Harrison is just great. It's really father-like, and I just think it suits the character really well.
To be speedy yet smooth takes time and experience, Coco.
I think Chuggington is ultimately about growing up. It's all about the gradual transformation of these trainee characters. And like I said, that's also reflected in characters like Harrison or Chatsworth or Callie or Dunbar, who all have this greater lived experience and are teaching it to the trainees. We even see them learn to appreciate the older chuggers too, like Aldwin and Pete, and they realize they're not as uncool as I thought they were. Unlike Thomas, where it felt like the characters would never progress and always remain the same, the early and middle years of Chuggington really did go out of its way to show the progress of these characters. There's a surprisingly good amount of continuity. Now the episodes are kind of all messed up and we don't really know the correct order, but there is one episode in series 1 where Eddie is late, and then there's another episode where Hodge actually finds a house for him, and then Eddie's never late again in the series. Or there's one episode in series 1 where Puffer Pete has an offhanded remark about an old chugger he knew called Speedy McAllister.
That's Speedy McAllister, or was it Cannibal Coop?
But then all the way in series 2, they actually introduce a character called Speedy McAllister as a new character. Over 24 episodes since Pete had that offhanded remark, and they pay it off now? That's so cool. Hoot and Toot were also two new characters for series 2, and I think they're a fun concept. They're also meant to be younger than Wilson, Coco and Brewster, again showing that these three characters are slowly growing throughout the series. Although interestingly, Hoot and Toot were actually planned for series 1, as early models can be seen of them here, and why the roundhouse that the trainees sleep in actually has 4 berths. I had always wondered why there is 4 berths instead of 3, so it is kind of cool that that was always planned for Hoot and Toot, and it just didn't happen until series 2. Again, series 2 will continue the trainees' general learning of the railway. Hell, there was even an Emery episode written by Davy Moore, who would go on to write for Thomas and Friends. Now I'll be honest with you, I'm not the biggest fan of some of the later classic era Chuggington characters, because honestly, most of the newer characters from that era kind of feel pointless. Like, I've never been the biggest fan of Skylar, as he arrived in the series around series 3, and he just sort of replaced Dunbar as the leader role. Granted, they at least had had an episode describing Dunbar leaving to see the world, unlike some other shows I could mention, but he just felt a little redundant. Same goes for Piper, who is meant to be the youngest character, like even younger than Hoot and Toot, and yet for some reason they made her a steam engine? Why? Up to this point they were always really consistent with the steam engines being the older characters. Why did you make her young? She also feels a little pointless since we already have a character like Zeffy, who is the young girl character, so I don't know why they would introduce her. And then there's Decca, whose name comes from being a double decker. Get it? Because she's a double decker? Again, Decca just feels like a Matambo, you know? I don't think she really added anything to the series. Now, it's possible that they actually had more interesting plans for Decca, as some of her episodes actually got cut from Series 3. That's right, believe it or not, Chuggington Series 3 was cut down to only 14 episodes, meaning 12 episodes were cut from the series. Series 3 of Chuggington was actually going to be much more ambitious than the final product, but unfortunately, due to toy sales not meeting demand, along with investors pulling out of the series, we only ever got 3 of the 8 new characters, those being Piper, Skylar, and Decca. It seemed that Chuggington, this flash-in-the-pan show, was finally losing its spark. After 2 somewhat successful seasons, the show in Series 3 just kind of fizzled out. I really am curious as to what those 12 cut episodes would have been about, but unless Sarah Ball or someone from the team come forward, we really don't know anything about what those episodes would have been about. Were they just Series 4 characters, or was it something new entirely? We may never know. And that's pretty much the end to classic era Chuggington. It started off well, but by Series 3 the show just kind of flatlined, not even being able to finish its original batch of episodes. Ladies and gentle chuggers, we have finally made it to the update era. So, following the failure of Series 3 of Chuggington in 2011, Lundorum sought to soft reboot the series. The main characters, Brewster, Wilson, and Coco, all got updates, such as hazard stripes on their sides, new lights, and even a speed booster for Coco, going from trainees to being promoted to bigger roles in Chuggington. This meant introducing new teams for them to interact with, such as Wilson joining Chug Patrol, which are basically like the Soda Search and Rescue team, and Brewster joining the Chuggineers, who are essentially the engineer chuggers, and Coco joining the Speed Fleet, which are basically high-speed passenger trains. I actually really love that they decided to progress the characters like this. The fact that they were always training in the first few seasons, only to have them progress in their own careers, is really nice. Like, seriously, how many kids shows can you mention where they actually progress the characters' training? Now, I'm sure you're all wondering, what about those older characters from the first few seasons? Well, to be honest, most of them got pushed aside in favor of newer characters from each team that the trainees joined. Dunbar was like the teacher to the 3 trainees, but since Chug Patrol had Jackman as Wilson's mentor, and Zach as Brewster's mentor, and Kenji, Hanzo as Coco's mentor, Dunbar and Skylar essentially became redundant as characters. And then there's Callie. Now, in the early season, Callie was the rescue chugger, with her own theme and everything, but because of Chug Patrol, they kinda retconned that, giving Callie a new red paint scheme. I like that they bothered to remember her, and they didn't just replace her with some other chugger. It was a nice way of preserving the continuity. Although I think this move kinda killed Callie as a character. Like, after the reboot, we never saw her again. Although, to be fair, there was an episode with Callie dealing with her feelings, like being a second part, so I'll give it a pass. Even though it was her only lead role as a character, but whatever. Hey, wait a minute. A favorite fangirl character who lots of fans liked later gets repainted red for a reboot before being tossed aside for a new character who uses her model and is more diverse? Now, where have I heard that before? Now, the new leader of Chug Patrol was Jackman. Like I said, Jackman sort of became the new role model to Wilson, and he also has a Northern Irish accent, so he's okay in my books. And then there's Asher. Not too much to say about him. I kind of would have preferred if they had just made him out to be an ambulance or something. I think it would have made him stand out a bit better or something, I don't know. We also have Brewster joining the Chuggineers, and honestly, I think that role suits him so well. It's like when boys go out of school and get jobs in engineering or construction. It's nice to see that represented through Brewster, and it just suits him. I also like how Zach is like a mentor to him, and the almost couple-like dynamic between Tyne and Fletch is just so sweet. And finally, we have Coco joining the Speed Fleet with her mentor Hanzo. Now, out of all the trainees, I think Coco got the best role. Being a speed passenger train just feels like something Coco would always want to do. It was even mentioned about her passing her speed exam all the way back in Series 1. So to see that become a reality later on is so satisfying. And I also like how they paired her up with Hanzo, who is a super fast Japanese bullet train, which I really like because it feels so inspired by real bullet trains. So many changes for this update era. Even the dynamic of the show had changed, where before, as I said, there was a usual A plot with the trainees and a B plot with the secondary chuggers, and then they come together in the end. The plot structure in Series 4 was completely different, where you have one plot with, let's say, the Chuggineers doing something, and then a B plot with Chug Patrol, you know, but then the two plots come together in the end. While it's similar to the old plot structure, I think the issue is that we sort of split up the main protagonists of the show. Like Wilson, Coco, and Brewster always now have to be with their respective teams, meaning it can be harder for them to interact in plots. I think another issue with this is that because we spend so much time with these new characters, all the older characters from the early seasons almost fade into the background. Classic characters like Hodge, Puffer Pete, Harrison, and others were all reduced to really minor roles. The only time we ever really used them was whenever we needed to rescue them, like Emery for example. Hell, just look at how much screen time V got in the early seasons versus Series 4. Yeah, barely any. Perhaps if they had let more of the original Chuggers join groups, like imagine Dunbar as a Chuggineer or Emery as a Speedfleet member, perhaps that would have helped them stay a little more relevant. And it's for that reason I think Chuggington Series 4 and 5 aren't really loved as much as the classic Chuggington era. Now, I'll be honest, I actually really like Series 4. I like how all the episodes and plots feel connected. It feels much more like a serialized show rather than an episodic one. But I think I'm in the minority when I say that I like Series 4, because most Chuggington fans generally don't like this updated Chuggington.
Looks like rain.
A little rain never hurt anybody.
Looks like rain.
A little rain never hurt anybody.
Series 5 pretty much continued the same as Series 4, however what was interesting was that it did focus slightly more on the side characters, like Callie got her first episode, Harrison finally got some more focus in Series 2, Jackman and Fetch got some time to shine, and hell, we even got a whole episode that didn't feature Coco, Wilson or Brewster at all, with an episode at the docks. Oh yeah, speaking of which, we did get some new locations like the docks and 4 salty clones. okay, perhaps that's a little bit harsh. Although this is actually a nice bit of world building, since the docks had already been foreshadowed all the way back in Series 1 on one of V's monitors, but we just didn't see it until now, so I actually find the fact that they added the docks quite cool. Although Series 5 of Chuggington was pretty much a flop, Series 5 was cut down by like 16 episodes and only having 10 in total. Just in general, the whole updated Chuggington era kind of fizzled out. So many investors had pulled out by this point that the entirety of Series 5 was funded by Tomy alone, hence why only 10 episodes were ever made. And that was really it for Chuggington. It's crazy how history repeated itself with Series 3 and then Series 5. Other than some online shorts that really just were recuts of old episodes, Chuggington was pretty much dead as a franchise. The show just kind of ran its concept into the ground. The show just kind of ended in 2015. However, it wouldn't be the last time that we saw Chuggington as a franchise. Following Chuggington's second failure, the series went on an indefinite hiatus. Lindorum, the crowd who made Chuggington, was eventually bought out by Hirchland Entertainment in 2018, and Lindorum itself eventually went into liquidation in 2019. The new company sought to reboot Chuggington again. This involved the show going back to its roots. No more updated Chug Patrol or Speed Fleet or Chuggineer plots. No. It was almost like a return to what Chuggington was. They made the stories more about the 3 trainees again, and the series got a new title, Chuggington Tales from the Track, being relaunched in 2020. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of Series 6 of Chuggington. To me anyway, it just feels like a completely different show from what Chuggington was before. Granted, there are a few things I like about the series, like it did fix a lot of the problems that the fans had with Series 4 and 5, with those seasons feeling so disjointed from Chuggington. I like that it's more focused on the 3 main characters again. But then there's some other stuff I find questionable. For example, they stripped down the main cast, which I do kind of understand, but they got rid of characters like Tyne, Fletch, Decca, and the Salty Clones, which I do understand them. But then there's characters like Harrison, or Dunbar, or Chatsworth, who were like main characters, and now they're just completely removed from the show. In some cases, they repainted old characters like Skylar, who got completely remade as a new character. Now, I never really cared for Skylar as a character, so it didn't bother me that much, but the one that really upset me was the fact that they completely erased Callie in exchange for Ty. Like, whatever about making her disappear clear from the show, but just the fact that they erased her into this new character is what really put me off Series 6.
This is Callie Fan here with a very important message about Chuggington. Ty is inferior to Callie in every single way.
Now, that being said, it doesn't mean I hate the new characters. Like, if anything, I think their episodes and songs are like the highlight of the season. I just hate the fact that the show erased Callie and used her model for Ty. Now, Ty is an Asian-inspired character and is a new trainee in Chuggington. In a weird way, Ty almost became like the fourth member of the little trainee clique. In fact, she would later join a part of the dockside crew, which actually fits her character since apparently she worked at a docks back in Asia. And then there's Rosa, who is a Spanish-speaking inspired locomotive. At first, Rosa felt lost in Chuggington, but eventually she became a member of the Chuggineers. Again, I really love that they gave these two characters roles and jobs. Another thing I surprisingly liked was a lot of the songs from Series 6. I highly recommend giving some of them a listen. Little Wagalagan is an incredibly wholesome Wilson song. It reminds me a lot of those Steven Universe ukulele songs.
Yeah, there's nothing I'd rather be a dragon than my little Wagalagan.
Rosa's song about missing home is really sweet. And goddamn, they did not need to go as hard as they did for the Brewster Hodge song.
Because no matter what we're going through, even if it's scary, I know.
This song is so wholesome. I love it. While I do think these episodes are a return to form to Chuggington, I honestly felt like these episodes had a complete disconnect from what Chuggington was in the classic era. There are a lot of things that made classic Chuggington such a unique and fun show that just doesn't really apply to Series 6 of Chuggington. It's just the little things that feel kinda off to me, like the music, for example, of Series 6 feels kinda off. It's not bad, but it just feels a little more generic in my opinion. Especially when you compare it to the music of the first few seasons where it sounded like real railway, steam engines and bells and whistles and noises. It honestly just feels like a more generic train show. There is the odd episode I like. For example, Hodge breaks down and Brewster is asked to give him his motor, and we get a very sweet episode about it. Honestly, one of the most sweetest and wholesome episodes in the whole series. But other than the odd episode like that, there's not too much to write home about. The show had heart at times, but other than a few exceptions, that unique Bob the Builder-esque voice that Chuggington got from Sarah Ball in the early years just didn't feel present here. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of Series 6, I will say I really like how it ended. One of the last episodes of the series, Celebrate Chuggington, whilst a very generic episode that is just full of songs, I think it was a really nice way to end the show. While technically not the last episode aired, I do feel like it's the more fitting finale. Not only was the episode written by Sarah Ball, most if not all the main characters from Series 6 were in this episode, and also the ending shot of the episode is really cool too, where we have all the main characters celebrating, and where we get this lovely long take of the roundhouses. We even get a callback to the opening of the show as the camera slowly follows this bird as it flies around, and the last shot is with the three trainees we've known and loved for the last few seasons as the camera slowly pans up to the sky in one long take. And yeah, that's it. That's the final shot of Chuggington, and honestly, I couldn't ask for anything better. So now that we've gone through the whole Chuggington series, I wanted to finally answer an age-old question about the series. The question being, is it a rip-off of Thomas? Thomas fans and Chuggington fans have debated this for years. Now, there are some pretty obvious ones, like how both shows are based around railways, and both have communities of train characters who learn certain life lessons in the show. But Thomas didn't invent talking trains. I want to see if there's any specific things that this show took from Thomas that you could accuse it of plagiarism. Well, first of all, Dick, the person who created the show, literally said that he wanted to create a more modern and up-to-date version of Thomas. So right there, that's the smoking gun that most Thomas fans point to this show being a ripoff. But just because Dick said he wants to make a more modern version of Thomas, does that mean the show is a ripoff of Thomas? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But you can definitely see a lot of Dick's inspiration rubbing off into Chuggington. Like, for example, Thomas has arguably three main protagonists, those being Thomas Thomas, Percy, and James. They're often the poster children of the show. And then Chuggington has Wilson, Coco, and Brewster. So is that evidence of the show being a ripoff? What about the roundhouses? In Thomas, Tidmouth is the main place for all the engines to sleep, but in Chuggington, the sheds is a double story. I can totally picture Dick saying, "What, Thomas has a single story shed? Well, fuck that, we're gonna make it a double story shed. Take that, Thomas!" And then there's Harrison, who's like a Gordon clone, where he's very proud of himself. Hell, he even has a snowplow like Gordon. Did Chuggington rip this off? What about the two mayors? They look pretty similar. What about the rubbish collecting chugger Irwin? The rubbish collecting chugger who happens to have glasses? Totally different from the rubbish collecting engine who has glasses in Thomas. Thomas has a yellow ice cream factory, and Chuggington has a yellow ice cream factory. Chuggington has an old abandoned town, and Thomas has an old abandoned town. Chuggington has a docks with a pirate-like character, while Thomas has a docks with a pirate-like character. Chuggington has an LNER 4 class, while Thomas has Spencer. Okay, so obviously I'm joking a bit here, because some of these comparisons to Thomas that fans make are definitely reaching, you know? But like, if you actually sat down and wrote out every single similarity that Chuggington quote-unquote stole from Thomas, I think you'd probably find more differences than commonalities. Chuggington has a completely different structure from Thomas. From the lack of a narrator, to more character-driven stories, to more nuanced approach to the trains. Other than these two shows being about trains, what do they really have in common? I'll be honest, not that much. You know what? In a weird way, you could nearly argue that Thomas ripped off Chuggington. Like in Journey Beyond Soda, when the characters just magically start bouncing themselves. Is that not Thomas stealing from Chuggington? Or what about making Percy and James bigger main characters? Remember, Thomas was always the main character of the original show. It was only after Chuggington did Wilson, Coco, and Brewster that Thomas finally started to push them as mains, right? What about the episode where Thomas puffed bubble liquid? Was that not a ripoff of Chuggington when Olwen started doing that too? Was Kana a ripoff of Coco? Gustavo's top looks kind of like Wilson. What about having a better gender balance or more inclusivity? Did Thomas take that from Chuggington? There is an episode where Olwen is in the roundhouse and an icicle lands on her, very similarly to how Spencer is in the shed and an icicle lands on him. Was that not taken from Chuggington? Did Thomas rip off this from Chuggington? Okay, so jokes aside, we can scream about Chuggington stealing from Thomas until the cows come home, and yes, I won't deny that there are some strong possibilities that Chuggington lifted ideas from Thomas. I'm looking at you, Harrison and Irving. And as I said, Dick did say that he wanted to make a more modern version of Thomas with diesels instead of steam engines, so that's the smoking gun in the room right there. But to be honest, those little examples are really the only things that you can claim that Chuggington stole from Thomas. And that really only applies to a few minor things in Series 1, as pretty much everything else in the Chuggington franchise has nothing to do with Thomas. And I definitely think the show really grew into its own identity. Plus, it's not like you can say Thomas didn't borrow anything from Chuggington. I mean, have you just seen those bouncing engines? Ironically enough, a lot of the points that Dick made would later be addressed in Thomas, like the gender imbalance, or the faster pace, or having more progressive messages in the show. Although, ironically though, that is kind of how Thomas lost his voice. So, to answer the question, do I think Chuggington is a rip-off of Thomas? My answer would be Sort of, in that the idea started off with Dick basically wanting to make his own version of Thomas. But the show developed, and new people like Sarah Ball joined the team, and the show sort of developed into its own thing, to the point that I think it's slightly unfair to just label it as nothing more than a Thomas ripoff. I think Thomas fans tend to view Chuggington through the lens of Thomas, and I think that's a mistake. While it's fun to compare and contrast these shows, I still think it should be viewed on its own merits, and not just through the lens of Thomas and it being a ripoff of that show, but that's just my 2 cents. As I said in the intro, Thomas fans generally tend to look their noses down in Chuggington, but I think if they actually gave the show a fair chance, I think they'd realise that there's actually quite a few things to appreciate about the show, at least in the first 3 seasons anyway. I'll be honest, Thomas losing sight of what it was honestly what drove me to come back to Chuggington after all these years. And in a weird way, I think I've actually found a new appreciation for the show. I'll be honest, I would probably pick Chuggington over All Engines Go, because say what you want about Chuggington, but at least that show feels more like a show about talking trains. They have jobs, they have controllers, and they're aiming towards a goal of helping a railway, whilst All Engines Go, and to an extent Big World Adventures, intentionally go out of their way to try and not be train shows. Chuggington just feels more like an actual train show than All Engines Go. I feel like it has more lore and more depth. Even though one is technically called Thomas, I ironically think that Chuggington did a better job with portraying the railways. The fact that I'm now at a point where I'm praising Chuggington, fucking Chuggington, says a hell of a lot about where the Thomas franchise is now. So, if you're a jaded Thomas fan and you're bored by the franchise right now and you've nothing else to watch, why not give Chuggington a chance? The 2 episodes I'd recommend watching are Late Again Eddie and Hodge and the Magnet. If you're a Thomas fan who's never seen Chuggington, check out these episodes and tell me your thoughts in below. I also want to give a massive shout out to my friend Rudley D, who was a huge help with this video, looking over the script and suggesting things to talk about, and even producing music from Chuggington. Rudley D actually did some pretty fantastic Chuggington facts videos on his own channel. I highly recommend watching them. The link to his stuff will be down below. I also wanted to give a shout out to my friend Callie Fan, who made a quick cameo in this video and has actually made his own Roblox Chuggington server. If you're a fan of Chuggington or just want to explore the layout of the town, I highly recommend playing his Chuggington Roblox game. The link to that will also be below. So please, as Thomas fans, tell me your thoughts on Chuggington down below, as I'd really love to hear what Thomas fans have to say about this show. Honking horns! That was my review of Chuggington. I can't thank you all enough for watching. Have a traintastic day everyone, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Slán Uailne!